This is the gospel for Sunday, January 27th. You'll notice I'm dressed pretty casually. The sanctuary is warm. It's going to be much warmer this coming Sunday. So if you're watching this beforehand and plan to attend church in person this coming Sunday, wear cool, comfortable clothes, bring water, and if wherever you're going to be, if you're in the Pacific Northwest with the heat wave they're predicting, drink water. If you see anyone outside, feel free to offer them water. If you have friends and family who don't have, or even strangers who don't have a place that is cool, please think about inviting them inside. Mark chapter 9, verse 41, Jesus speaks about those who offer a cool cup of water and that they will not lose their reward. The gospel for Sunday, the 27th, is Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through, I believe, 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him. He was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is on the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said, "Do you see the crowd pressing in? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in awe and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they looked at him and laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, in Aramaic, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years old. And they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Please join me in prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. There are a number of things that jump out in this passage. My sermon's probably going to be a bit longer than what I preach on Sunday, and that's because Sunday is going to be very hot, and I'm going to keep things brief. But my sermon here, first off, we have, as Mark often does, we have two separate stories. Mark starts the first story, jumps to the second story, concludes the second story, comes back to the first story. So the first story is a frame around the second story. And the first story helps us interpret the second story. And the second story helps us interpret the first story. This framing, this chiasm, is a common feature of Mark's gospel. So our action picks up. We've jumped a little bit from last week. Last week, Jesus was crossing from one side of the Sea of Galilee, the Jewish side, to the other side, the Gentile side. In between, in Mark chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, which you can read in your own Bibles, Jesus encounters a Gentile man living among the dead who is possessed by demons, the Gerasene demoniac. And after that encounter, Jesus comes back across. Now, it's very possible that Jesus did other things in the Gentile side, in the Decapolis, but Mark only wants to tell us about that one thing. Mark tells us some of what Jesus says and does. He doesn't say all of it. Just as we get some of the words of what Jesus says in chapter 5, we probably imagine that there are other words in there. We're getting a summary. And this is also true of Matthew and Luke and John as well. None of the Gospels say this is a verbatim, word-for-word account of everything Jesus said. In any case, Jesus has come back across the Sea of Galilee. He's come back to the Jewish side. He has come back to an area presumably fairly near where he grew up. And he is rock star famous. There are crowds who are following him, gathering around him. And we have one of the leaders of the synagogue. We have Jairus, or however you say his name, sorry. Just a reminder, pastors don't always know either. Who is there? This is someone of prominence. This is someone who would have been important in their community, who has asked for help for his daughter. He has asked Jesus, who is an itinerant, he's moving from place to place. He doesn't have an official role. This is someone with an official role who is asking Jesus for help. As Jesus is going to help this Jewish leader, this person of authority, a woman comes to him who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years. The Greek makes clear that her hemorrhaging has been a menstrual sort of hemorrhage, which would have in Judaism made her ritually unclean for 12 years. That means that for 12 years in Judaism, this woman could not legally be touched by anyone else. For to do so would make that person ritually defiled. For 12 years, this person could not engage with another person. And she thinks to herself, if I but touch the hem of his garment, I might be made well. The crowd is pressing close around Jesus, but Jesus is aware of the power going out of him. And Jesus says, "Who touched my clothes?" And he looks around, and this woman comes forward. Now, for 12 years, she has been living faceless and voiceless among this community. For 12 years, people were not supposed to touch her or engage with her. For 12 years, she has been a shadow figure, living a shadow life. When I read this passage, I can't help but think of the tent communities that I see in Simpson Park, here in Albany, the people that I see living rough near where I live off of 53rd, the communities in Salem, in Portland, in Corvallis, the people who are just trying to find any place they can to get by, the people gathering in helping hands, the people who are seen but not seen, who we drive past, who we ignore, who we assume that we know some of their story. But people who are experiencing houselessness are but a fraction of those people. You might at times feel like a shadow person, someone who the rest of society would rather not pay attention to. Some of the elderly people sometimes do not feel heard. Some children do not feel heard and paid attention to. You might identify with this woman. And Jesus pays exactly as much attention to her as he does to this prominent leader in the community. Jesus treats her the same as he treats Jairus. He considers her to have as much value and worth. And he says that her faith made her well. Now, it is worth noting that in chapter 2 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus heals someone who is paralyzed, whose friends lower them down through the roof. And in that case, Jesus says that the friend's faith makes the person well. Jesus pays attention to a wide variety of people. Jesus pays attention to a wide variety of people that the rest of society ignores. And he doesn't leave Jairus hanging. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's going to be it." Jairus, who is a frantic father, and if you have, as a parent, ever had your child sick, I can think of the first time Mary was just a little bit sick. She just had a cold, but she wasn't right. My wife wasn't around. She was working. I'm like, what should I do? I was nervous and stressed out. Well, Jairus' daughter is tremendously sick. And when people come and say, "I'm sorry, your daughter has died," I can't imagine how much his heart must have dropped. And still, Jesus goes to the house. And when people say, "What are you doing here?" and Jesus says she's but sleeping, I have to imagine it was a laughter born out of sorrow and exhaustion, because they must have hoped the same. But Jesus brings just his disciples, just the little girl's mom and dad up. And he says to her in Aramaic, "Little girl, wake up." Now I note that Aramaic part, just to note that Jesus and his disciples, and indeed most of the people in that part of the world at the time, were multilingual. They didn't just speak Hebrew, but some of them spoke Greek. Almost all of them spoke Aramaic. The Lord's Prayer, or at least the opening of the Lord's Prayer, was originally in Aramaic. Language was a fungible thing. Jesus didn't just speak in one language, didn't just speak to one people, didn't just speak to one community. He came to everyone. He came to the Jews and the Gentiles. He came speaking in Hebrew like one of the great teachers, and speaking in Aramaic, which was the common language, the lingua franca of his time. He healed this woman who was ritually unclean, and he made the community pay attention to her when she spoke, and made them realize that she had been living in their midst, a kind of shadow life, and he brought her to life. And to this little girl, he restored her to life. To both of them, he restored them to the community. And to both of them, even though their roles were different, one was nameless and older, one of them is nameless but daughter of a prominent member, to all of them, he brings life. He brings life to all of us as well. He meets us where we are, and whether we are rich or poor, strong or weak, whether we are successful economically or unsuccessful, whether we are anything, he sees what has worth in you and me and all of us. He calls us to life, and he comes to us as we are and sees awesomeness in you. Amen.